So this session is Women by the Numbers, and it will be led by Martha Saenz, who is the Associate Director of the Women's Legislative Network at the National Conference for State Legislators. And if you don't know NCSL, I'm sure you all do, but they are an amazing resource, not only for all of the numbers and statistics that they have, but also because they are able to shed a light on what is often sort of an opaque process, everything from how budgets are made to, how legislation actually gets through, and some of the kind of nitty gritty of the rules in various state houses. Martha is an expert in state legislative engagement, particularly involving women legislators and legislators of color. And so she's going to talk today. I mentioned to some of you at dinner last night, it's amazing how with all of the gains that women have made recently in terms of numbers, it's still, only a quarter of governors, only a third of legislators. So even with the gains, we're still obviously very far below the 50% of the population that we are. So with that, please join me in welcoming Martha.
Is this working? Am I working? Am I on? Okay, perfect. It seems weird to have a mic in such a small room, but they told me they're recording, so I'm going to go with it. Thank you, and I'm Martha Saenz, as she mentioned. My roles at NCSL include, of course, staffing the Women's Legislative Network. I'll talk a little bit more about the network itself. And also, in addition to that, so I also staff the National Caucus of Native American State Legislators, which is a group of NCSL that's actually, NCSL serves as its fiscal agent, but it is a separate group. So it has its own bylaws and operates within its own policies and things like that. I also have a project that we manage. It's called the Quad Caucus. I'll talk a little bit more about that too, but that's just a convening of the 4 national caucuses of color. So. Before I get started, I always like to know kind of who's in the room so that I know who I'm presenting to. So I'm going to cover a couple of regions, but if you're from a region that I missed, just raise your hand, let me know where you're from. So who's from East Coast? Perfect. Midwest? Awesome. Southeast? Cool. West? Awesome. Okay, I'm Colorado based, so I am so sad that I'm not going to be here the rest of the time with you guys. I'm leaving later on today. It's okay. All good. Maybe, right? All right. It's okay. I messed up the whole computer thing earlier, so, All right, so I'm going to start with who's NCSL. So NCSL is the bipartisan organization for state legislators and state legislative staff. So we represent all 7,386 state legislators, provide policy and research training. So a lot of us attend new member orientation for state legislators when they enter into office, especially because we have that awesome turnover every couple of years in state legislators where re-education needs to be done. We're the federal voice for states, so sort of looking at advocating for state rights, that kind of thing. And then we build connections. So our major thing is NCSL's Legislative Summit, which happens annually. This year it'll happen in Louisville. I'll give a slide on that too. So just a little NCSL plug. I keep looking over here, but there's nothing there. I just wanted to start with a little bit of an overall demographic view of state legislators. So what we're looking at here, we're not into women yet, of course, but there are 7,386 state legislators. That includes the U.S. territories. There's 2,069 total Senate seats, more Republicans than Democrats. Anybody surprised by that? Same with the House. So House seats, of course, there's more. There's 5,503. Same, more Republicans than Democrats. Okay, a little bit of engagement here. Does anyone know which state has the most state representatives? New Hampshire. So New Hampshire has 400 state representatives in the House. So there's only 24. There's only 24 in the Senate. So we'll highlight that a little bit later. But yeah, quite a few. The running joke there is if you weren't paying attention, your name might actually accidentally end up on the ballot. That's not true. There were 302 women that ran in 2022 that did not win. So state partisan composition. I just threw this up here just to have a general idea of where we're at nationally. I think it's always helpful to kind of set some context here. So we're looking at, I don't think anybody's surprised by anything that's happening here, but we are seeing a shift in state legislatures, and a lot more of them have turned red over the past few years. All right, NCSL's Women's Legislative Network. So the Women's Legislative Network is a network of all women state legislators. So it includes everything from professional development, trainings, to a track at NCSL's Legislative Summit focused on policies that are specific to women, everything from maternal health to sort of caregiving, and women in budgets and pensions. We are governed by a 14-member board that is regional. They sit across the nation. This is our current board that the slide did not update, so I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure why it did that, but our current sitting president, so this is our president, vice president, so our president-elect, vice president, and immediate past president are our officers. They're the ones who kind of make sure that they help guide our policy areas. Our board switches annually from a Democrat to a Republican, so we are sure to include all issues. They, again, just help us navigate. This is Representative Melissa Ballard. She's from Utah. There's Representative Daphne Michelson-Janae. She's from Colorado. Representative Deanne Vaught is from Arkansas. And then that's Representative Stephanie Clayton, and she's from Kansas. So sorry about that again. All right, we're gonna look a little bit over where have states been? So it's always good for me. I was a history and poli sci nerd, so I always like to start of, okay, where did we start? Where have we been? Where are we going? More trivia questions. So where did the first women serve as state legislators?
I know the first state senator was in Utah.
Yeah, and you know how she got it?
She beat her husband.
She beat her husband. Yeah, she ran against her husband. She was a Republican, he was a Democrat, and won. So, yeah, that was right. Great dinner conversations. Colorado. Colorado was the first. So there were 3 women that were elected, Reps Clara Cressingham, Carrie Hawley, and Frances Clock. And that was 1894. So well before women had the rights to vote nationally, but 275 years after the first legislative convening in Jamestown.
If any of y'all are at the U.S. Capitol, Utah's state senators are statues, so the women.
Yep. And the Rotunda area. Yep. All right. This is just a slide I wanted to include just because I think it's always fun to kind of see what the makeup was. This is not Colorado's. This is Wisconsin's first legislative women legislators, and they actually are just significant in this picture just because, this was in 1924, so right after women had the right to vote, and now there are 41 of them in Wisconsin. So we're just going to look at growth over time. So these are the fun graphs and things like that to get into. I want to note here where the milestones are. So you'll see those lines, the purple line. Took a while to get there, right? We're looking at sort of 1970s is when we hit the 10% milestone. 20% milestone was hit in the 1990s. 1992 was pegged a while ago as the year of the women, and then we didn't hit 30% until 2020, so very recently. Still a ways to go. So it looks like, starting in the 1970s, if we're hitting a milestone sort of and a marker every 2 decades, the question is, right, will we have to wait till 2080 to see parity? Let's hope not. These slides are interesting, I think, because what I did was break out Democrats versus Republicans and the representation of them through time. And what we see here, really, in Senate seats in particular, but we'll switch to the next slide and see it for the House side also, is really one, that there's always more Democrat women than Republican. That tends to be a trend throughout. But the other thing is, whenever we see heights of one, we see dips in the other party. And that seems to be sort of a trend throughout time. Same for the House. This is women who run as third-party seats, so independent women. And this is, I only put this up here because it's such a small number. Like, it's almost hard to put on a graph at all. But it's the percentage of seats. So typically what we see is women fall within the two major party lines. Does anybody know which state is unicameral? Nebraska. Mm-hmm. Even though there's argument around that, but unicameral meaning it does not have a House and a Senate, it's just a Senate. Okay, so where we are now. So here's women representation in states by percentage. We know that the average is 33%. We just hit that mile marker this past year. The total number of women legislative seats is 2,460. It's give or take at any given day. There's sometimes a seat will fall off, somebody will retire, somebody will leave office. It just happens to be that way. And so what we're seeing here is some of the lowest states, like West Virginia, which still tends to be lower. The American Samoa, I put it a little bit lighter because it only has 5% representation of women. And so we always include the territories at NCSL because, you know, NCSL and territories are part of NCSL's membership. Nevada has the highest. Do you know what the percentage is? 60%. So they're well over the 50% mark. And, you know, between when we're looking at West Virginia and Nevada, so why we're sort of looking at that average of 33%. I want to highlight some other chambers. So Colorado is right at 50%. Chambers that stick out, because this isn't necessarily captured in the overall percentage, are New Mexico. So New Mexico's House is 50% women. Oregon House is 50% women. Let me just make sure I'm not missing any numbers. The New Hampshire Senate, 24, right? There's 400 in the House, 24 in the Senate, 12 of them are women. That's not the total in the House, of course. And then Ohio and Florida have more Republicans, more Republican women serving in the state legislature than Democrats. So they're one of the only two states that we see that happening in. For the most part, most of these are Democrats. I wanted to pull out a couple of just stick out kind of states. One, because there's some interesting things here that we see or that could be associated with where we're at with those states. So one is Nevada, of course, the highest representation of women. It hit that milestone in 2018, another year pegged as like Year of the Women. But they only convene every other year. So they convene in odd years. And you're going to hear from some of the presenters over the next couple of days about how women serve, why they serve, what the challenges are. But one of the challenges, of course, is when we're looking at women serving, are they serving in states where there's a higher salary, where maybe they don't have to go to the Capitol every year? Are they serving in areas where maybe they live closer to the Capitol, right? So do we see more concentrated representation in urban areas or closer to the Capitol itself? Because it would be rather hard for someone who's managing, trying to balance family and everything else with going to a state capitol if it's in a rural area. So for example, do we see more women in Atlanta than we do in somewhere like Kentucky? The other is California. So California is really they're showing that they are going to be very close to 50%, which is surprising because it's taken a while to get there, obviously, for everyone. They're at 41% now, but they're expected to be at 46% in November based on what we're seeing from primary results and those who are running unopposed. They've already had a 10% jump since 2020. So in 2020, we were seeing California tread around the 30% mark, and now we're seeing them at 41, closer to 50 this next election cycle. Arizona, I think this is just an interesting one because they did reach 50% in 2024. They are a Republican state. 16 out of the 30 senators are women. 29 out of 60 are representatives. Most of them are Democrat, but it is a changing sort of landscape in that area. West Virginia, I point out because West Virginia is still sort of trying to catch up. So 11.7% are women in West Virginia, 16 out of 134. Not a lot. But they weren't always there. So we sort of see them going down, which is, who knows? Who knows why? But I think there's a lot to be said here. And we're actually looking at and interviewing some of the women and seeing what the turnover is and trying to connect with the women there through the Women's Legislative Network to ask, hey, what's going on? Where can there be more support? What does this look like and what's changing? Here's a listing of women in legislative leadership. I point this out because it does not look like the map of women representation, right? So even in some of the states, we do see it trending along with those states that are in the sort of darker colors that I showed before. I'll show a comparison slide in a minute. But for these states in particular, and I want to know Washington and Pennsylvania, both chambers, so the Senate president and the Speaker of the House are women. That is not common in every other state. And all of those other states that you see there still have male leaders.
Wait, I don't understand.
Sure. So this is if there is a speaker or Senate president in the state that is a woman, they're like in the reddish color. Oh, let me double check it. And what we do know that there are, let me just double check that because that might just be a mistake on here. But there are 97 women that serve as the either the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate. So we also lump in, so this one's not including like Speaker pro tem, it's not including Senate President pro tem, any majority leaders or minority leaders. So I think that is one of them. So it's only if they're in the top. So if they're Speaker or Senate President, they're on this map. Otherwise, there are 97 women representation for this. So for example, Georgia, the Speaker pro tem is Jan Jones, right? So that would have been here if I had included sort of the next person down from the highest. So for NCSL's sake, what we do is we do Senate President pro tem, so we're not including lieutenant governors on here either. Yep. So it's just when they're considered what we consider leadership, because that's who NCSL has to go to sort of ask permission for certain things, and that's who we work with on our trainings. So in some cases, yes, states have lieutenant governors will serve as the Senate President, but in this case, what we're looking at is those who are highest ranked in either the Senate or the House. So it's either Senate President pro tem in those cases where the lieutenant governor, of course, all 50 states are different in how they do this. Speakers are a little bit easier. It's just the House, just the Speaker. That's the highest office you can have. Make sense?
Are you
Sorry.
able to take questions at this point, or do you want to wait till the end?
It doesn't matter. Is there a preference from?
I mean, it's really up to you.
Yeah, I'm fine with questions.
So.
Hi. So I was just wondering if you knew of the states that have women in leadership, what the effect of having term limits in state legislatures is on that. Like I work in Rhode Island. We have like a fair amount, not half, but fair amount of women in our legislature, but there is no one in leadership. And like Rhode Island, also because of the sort of political nature of the state, like the people who are in leadership have been there for decades, and the only time they leave is if they want to leave or they die.
Which sometimes women get those seats, right? They really like sticking around. No, we haven't necessarily seen a correlation between the two, although I can't say that we've tracked it as closely for some of those states, but it tends to be a little bit different now. It's more aligned with, are there over that 30% mark of women representation is what we're seeing sort of up and coming in leadership. So that's what we're seeing a little bit more of than term limits affecting it. But term limits overall affect the turnover and the representation of women. So it's not that we're not seeing women run. We are seeing women run more often, but what's happening is that they're also leaving more often. So we are seeing that term limits are affecting that, and they're just, again, you'll hear over the next couple of days on why some of those reasons are expected, but some of that could just be the balance is unrealistic because a lot of them go in necessarily thinking, oh, it's a part-time legislature, I'm gonna be part-time work and I can still keep my full-time job, which most of them have, and that's just not what it ends up being. So here's what we were saying before. So I put these two maps together. So the women in state legislatures representation and where we're sort of seeing some of those numbers alongside with where we see women leadership. And again, it is not all of the leadership, right? Because we have minority leaders, we have, the Senate President pro tem. In some cases, that's the second rank instead of the Senate President when it's not the Lieutenant Governor. So again, it just depends on how the state constitution is written. But these are also not including majority leaders, those sort of thing. Any questions here? I don't want to leave this with sort of lingering anything. One other thing, so sort of trivia that's not on a slide, is there are 46 states that hold elections in even number years. Can anybody name the 4 that do not? So there are 4 states that just held elections in November 2023, and they sort of hold them on odd years. Virginia is one of them. New Jersey is another. Louisiana. And hold on. And I have something else in my notes here. Don't worry. So those states only hold odd year elections. So it's Mississippi, Louisiana, New Jersey, Virginia hold odd year elections. Then there's also 46 states that hold annual legislative sessions, right? So there are 4 states that meet only on odd number years. So again, the ongoing thing is if you've seen one state legislature, you've only seen one state legislature because they are all different and all have unique rules. So the 4 that don't meet every year are, and we already mentioned the one for Nevada, right? Montana, North Dakota, and Texas. So those are the ones that only meet in odd number years, unless there's a special session called.
Just 2 questions on the top leaders. Do you know what the breakdown is in terms of Democrat and Republicans?
I definitely didn't break it down for this particular thing, but majority of them are Democrat with the exception of Florida.
Yeah, that's my next point. And with you mentioned that we've also seen ebbs and flows in women coming in and the turnover and the representation of them going down. With the top leaders, is it kind of like once that person is in there, once that woman in top leadership is in there, are they more likely to be replaced by a man? Because I know that's the case that's going to happen in Florida. So I wrote an article about is it going to take another 20 years to have woman in leadership because there's only been 2 Senate presidents who are women.
Yeah, well, what we've seen is that it does lead to closer trends, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that it is going to be a woman who comes in right after that, of course, if they leave for any reason. That's the case in Oregon, but Oregon just voted again, and they will have another woman speaker come in. So right now it's a male, they had a female, and it's going to go back to female. So it was a much shorter term, I guess, for that legislative leaders. In general, we're seeing that legislative leaders are not around as long as they used to be. So before, we used to see legislative leaders would be around for sometimes 12 to 20 years. I think the highest now is in Mississippi, and he's been there for 12 years, but he's also retiring. And then the next is like 11 years in Wisconsin. So we're just seeing that legislative leaders aren't sticking around as long anymore. And maybe that's at the state legislative level. And that could be because of what we're seeing at the congressional level, right? So there's sort of there's this trend on, like, there's more opinions around who should be the leaders in each of these chambers. Yeah.
Please introduce yourself too before you.
Thanks. I'm Shaylee. I'm from Montana. So this is my own ignorance on other states, but I'm in an odd election or odd year session state. And so our leaders hold their leadership positions for 2-year terms. I'm curious, in other states that have annual election or annual sessions, if those elections are happening annually, like as often as the session, or if they hold longer terms as leaders, or how that varies, if there's any like trend or theme there.
I think it just depends on the state, right? And whether or not they flip partisan control. So if a state switches, all of them do the sort of every 2-year vote, right? Depending on where they're at. Most of them don't have limits on who they can elect again, and they don't. In some cases, they don't expect them to elect a new leader. It's just sort of like, oh, you've been the leader, let's elect you again. But it just depends on if there's a change in partisan control. So, example, if it switched from Democrat to Republican, of course they're going to get a new leader in. I put this slide in here just to cover caucuses and networks as a resource to be aware of when you're looking at women in state legislatures. There are a little over 30 states that have a women's caucus. In some cases, most of them are bipartisan. In some cases, there's sort of these informal gatherings in the state that are next to a beer caucus kind of thing. But for the most part, they are very formal. They have an official role. They gather and meet, and some of them are policy driven. So we at NCSL sort of break them down into whether or not they're a sort of policy caucus, whether or not they're informal or formal. And informal meaning, do they just gather for the sake of having a support network within the legislature to not feel isolated because there's fewer women. In other cases, it's a more formal gathering where they serve as mentors. So I wanted to highlight a couple of states. Louisiana in particular, their bipartisan women's caucus has staff, which is not always the case, right? So if you want information about women in legislatures, going to their resource, like a staff person in their women's caucus, is really helpful to get anything related to historical reference, what the state is doing currently, are there any policy areas that they're introducing and focused on for this year. So I wanted to highlight that, just for that to pay attention to. Some states have partisan staff, or not partisan, but they have staff to the women's caucuses. Other states have whoever the chair or the leader of the women's caucus is, their legislative aide serves as the staff to the caucus. So it's just a little bit more limited on the ability to have resources and information available. Hawaii in particular is one of the states that does a policy focus. So every year they introduce a complete package, a bipartisan package of bills related to women. So their members gather in the previous year when it's bill drafting time. So for 2023, they gathered and decided, we really want to address some issues, and they addressed human trafficking, improvements in childcare, and safeguarding access to reproductive health. So that was their package reform, again, bipartisan, and not every state gathers in that way. Indiana offers a scholarship to women. So they really get together to raise money as a women's caucus, and then they ensure that they give about 12 scholarships to women across the state who have not followed the traditional route to education. So they have to be 25 and over, and they're sort of looking at, again, a bipartisan network, but they want to make sure that in some ways that there's a network, a growth, and support for women who are interested in more leadership roles. This is women legislators of color, right? So what you'll see is the total number of women. So again, there's 2,400 total women. What we're seeing here is that it's not quite there yet. So the reflection of the population itself does not necessarily reflect, of course, what we're seeing as far as population in the states and women legislators of color represented. Any questions on this one? Any thoughts? Oh, do we need the mic for them?
Oh, I'm sorry. Right.
Okay, first of all, this is awesome. That's why you have so many questions. Thank you. Oh, sorry. I'm Anna Nichols from Michigan Advance. I was wondering where the Native lawmakers are. Is there a localization to that? Like, where are they around the country?
Montana. There's a lot in Montana. So Montana right now has the highest amount of Native legislators in general. Most of those are women. The other place that we're seeing a lot of Native women is, I want to say growth-wise, New Mexico. So it's kind of where we see higher Native populations as well. With the exception, of course, of Arizona, where we see the highest Native population, but not necessarily the highest Native number of legislators, and definitely not the highest number of women legislators.
Yeah. Where do you get this data?
So we have tracking that we do, but also with this one in particular, I have the slight advantage of serving as the National Caucus of Native American State Legislators. Okay. So we get some of our info from Know Who. We ensure that we go through each state and sort of do a survey of that. And then we have a database that also has who, if legislators identify a particular race or ethnicity in their filing papers, we make sure we note that.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
Hi, Ariama from Amsterdam News. I'm just curious, do they volunteer that information, or is it mandatory that they file how they identify?
I'd imagine that it's pretty hard. That I'm not actually sure of whether or not it's required. I'm not sure how every state requires them to file it. My guess is that all of this is self-identification, right? So even if it's mandatory, it's how they self-identify.
Got you.
I mentioned that I do some work with the Quad Caucus. So the Quad Caucus is the convening, again, of the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators, the National Caucus of Native American State Legislators, the National Asian Pacific American Caucus of State Legislators. This is all a huge mouthful. And the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. And when we talk about celebrating firsts, this is the first time in the history of each of these caucuses, which all started at different times. Some of them, the Native Caucus is the newest one, started in 2005. The NBCSL, the Black Caucus, started in the 1970s. But this is the first time they're all women leading the caucuses. So each of the caucuses led by a president and a set of officers. In the same way that I showed you sort of Women's Legislative Network, there's a set of officers. This is the first time it's all led by women. So they decided, as most typical women do, that they wanted to get together and ensure that they're pushing for a policy agenda, and they wanted to focus on specific areas that impact women of color. So they looked at, the Native Caucus said, let's all get together, come with unified messaging on particular issue areas. And so the Native Caucus identified violence against women, mostly looking at issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and what that looks like. President Laura Hall from Alabama looked at maternal health, so infant mortality and maternal mortality, especially given the astonishing rates for Black women. Delegate Valderrama in Maryland wanted to focus on women as caregivers. AARP has information on how women serve as majority of caregivers. So she wanted to ensure that they can get together and do that. And then Representative Angela Romero, who's also the minority leader in Utah. Interesting little fact, all of the minority leadership in Utah is currently women. So, and it's interesting that it's a woman of color also. But what I've heard from other legislators in Utah, including the president, was that it's great to have leadership positions, but there's not a lot of political power for those minority leaders in states like Utah. And then she wanted to focus on wage gaps. So I put this up here just because these are also great resources if you're looking at in particular for women of color. And they pushed recently an agenda on at the end of Women's History Month. And so that also, they're looking at having individual sort of focused areas on each of those issue areas over the next year. So just kind of look out for that. Okay, where we're going. I put this up because me and Representative Lauren Daniels have a baby that's the same age. So I almost brought him strapped. Strapped on me, guys, strapped on me. So, there's still challenges, of course, to what we see for reaching parity. We have come a long way, as we've seen, right? Those growths charts over time show that there has been some growth. We are seeing milestones, which is great. But each legislature, of course, is extremely unique, in how they support women, in how they run, in what their term limits are, in what they pay, in all of those things that you're going to hear about over the next couple of days, and what they look like. So what we're seeing is that there are younger people running in general, right? Again, average state legislator is still 50-year-old white male, right? 2 years ago, it was a 54-year-old white male. So we're still seeing that. But when we are seeing women run, not only are we seeing stats with them being more effective, but we're seeing more women who are young mothers, right? But it's also the reason they're leaving office. So we're not seeing them stick around as long because of those things. So this photo is a photo of Representative Lauren Daniels. She is a Georgia legislator, Republican Georgia legislator, who at the end of special session in December, she had her baby with her for the whole 2 weeks of special session. And, he has his own little badge there. But she thanked the leadership, right? So she thanked the speaker and acknowledged them. So she wanted time on the floor to acknowledge the speaker's support of her being able to do this, which was pretty cool. So in addition, when I was in the Georgia State Capitol a couple of weeks ago, there's also one of those like Mama-Roo things. Also some changing landscapes in state legislative buildings. So in Capitol buildings, we're seeing some things like, those like things where you can breastfeed or mandatory changing tables for babies, that sort of things. And not just for the state legislators, but also for the women that come in and advocate for various issues in the state. And that's a long way from those states who barely added women's restrooms, because think about state capitals, right? They were not built with women in mind. So a lot of state capitals did not have women's restrooms until the 1970s. And some of those women's restrooms were converted from like weird old closets, Were you gonna say something?
No, you said the bathroom thing. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up this picture because we just had something similar in Nevada where our Senate Majority Leader brought her baby out on the floor. I'm curious if you're seeing that more and kind of like what the public conversations or perceptions have been. I guess like what are the conversations when female lawmakers bring their babies with them in this very present way?
Yeah, well, we're seeing it not only in this way, but because we're hearing that childcare is a huge issue, right? So I think what some of them are doing are making statements of like, listen, the policy areas in which I choose to prioritize are very personal to me. But also what we're seeing is that if we keep those women, right, there's just levels of support like that. So it says a lot when leadership itself brings the baby in, because it's like, oh, this is what it's going towards and what it's trending on. Before, when we used to have, like in the 1990s, when we saw women run, they weren't young mothers, right? And so that's something that we see different now, that there are young mothers who are running. And what was interesting is when she thanked them, she told the story about, this is her fourth baby. So she's a mom of four, and she had her first baby when she was 17, right? And so she talked about why it's important to support young mothers, because she was told so many times that she couldn't, that she wouldn't kind of be anything. So I think what we're seeing with aligning some of those policy areas like childcare shortages, the challenges with that, right? Access to it, that sort of thing. That's where we're seeing some of those trends go. But again, there are some cases like Oregon, right, where some of the legislators are also saying, you know what, I can't do this anymore because I'm a young mom and it's sort of taxing on my family.
Hi, I'm Amanda Perez Pintado. I'm with Puerto Rico Center for Investigative Reporting. I'm wondering, I recognize it's a lot of states, a lot of colonies, and a lot of people, but if you have any data on like state level of what policies these women lawmakers are pushing at a state level.
Yeah, and that's what we use our Women's Legislative Network for. So we do that in a very sort of like give us feedback kind of way. What are your top 10 priorities for this year? Can you narrow that down to what are your 3? And then we look at our legislative tracking databases, going through all of our different topic areas at NCSL and leverage, okay, what are the top areas that we're seeing pushes in, right? And so of course, childcare tends to be one of those, addressing maternal health, postpartum health, mental health, those sort of things tend to be priority areas for women. But then there's also women who are saying, we don't just want it to be a women's issue. We want it to be an issue that we address for everyone. And by addressing it for everyone, it's going to bring it up, it's going to improve the outcomes for one, their district and their community, but also, if it's communities of color or whatever else also.
And I wanted to ask as well, how do the priorities in the colonies differ from the states, and what challenges are the women lawmakers in the colonies talking about that might be different from what you guys are seeing at a state level?
Yeah, I think there are some women's issues that are kind of surprising that are passing in some our states, but it really depends on the partisan makeup of the state, right? And where they're at and where they want to go, and sort of whether or not they're leaning towards a more conservative sort of right, what does it look like as far as, are they addressing things like women's reproductive issues, right? And then the other is, are they more of a D state where they're doing things to protect sort of some of the limitations? But I think another surprising thing is menstrual product taxing and availability and accessibility. We're seeing that as a very bipartisan, nonpartisan issue, right? So in states like Indiana, where you wouldn't necessarily expect women legislators to be addressing that type of issue, they slipped it through in like a Senate finance bill over this past session on, eliminating taxes for menstrual products. So that's another one, like the pink tax is what we're seeing some trend on, where they can garner support from both sides of the aisle. Does that answer your question a little bit? It really does vary, depending on sort of the partisan makeup of the state on what the priorities are.
I don't know if this is maybe too specific, and if I don't really know how to premise this question, but I think there's at least the anecdotal or maybe the stereotypical belief that women lawmakers at all levels are more willing or likely to talk to the other side, to work across the aisle. And I'm wondering if you have any data, or if there would even be a way to measure whether having more women in state legislatures results in like more bipartisan support on bills, or just more action in general.
Mm-hmm. We are sort of ensuring that we track, and I know you'll hear from COP in a couple, and I don't know if it's later on today or tomorrow. I think it's tomorrow. But there are lots of studies that show not only do women introduce more bills, but they get passed more often when they do. And that is, and a lot of women that we interview saying, you know, how did you get this passed in this state? You know, it's been a challenge. It's been introduced for the past couple of years. And this year it passed. What was the difference? And they always say that it is the fact that they were willing to work across the aisle and find partnerships in areas that were necessarily not expected. So I think women are willing to go outside of the box a little bit in order to meet someone halfway, according to what our women legislators have said. That sort of concludes the formal part of my presentation. I just wanted to highlight a couple of other things for NCSL. So you can subscribe to NCSL's policy newsletters, highlighting some of these areas, right? There's our state legislatures magazine. So this is my little NCSL plug in general. If you, Ann did a great job earlier of ensuring that you guys are aware of that, but if you haven't turned to NCSL as a resource yet, please feel free to. And then this is our legislative summit. So our legislative summit is a convening, it has over 6,000 participants typically, a little over 1,000 state legislators participate, but it's policy sessions and experts from across the country. We have a Women's Legislative Network track. There's a Women's Legislative Network policy roundtables where they focus on specific areas that our board has identified. Some of those areas are the ones that I've already mentioned today. So like caregiving, access to childcare, inclusive workforce, those sort of things, women in construction and that growing industry. So wherever we see sort of trends and growth with women representation, we want to make sure that we're providing some education around that for our members, and our members are women state legislators. So yeah, if nobody's been to Louisville, which I've heard that the correct pronunciation, guys, is the least amount of syllables, right? Louisville. And so this is my contact info. Thank you for having me here today. I really do hope this was helpful. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yeah, the dirt.
I'm curious if you track at all women in committee chair positions, and or if you've noticed any trends in the types of committees they lead.
Yes, so we do track women committee positions. What we've seen is that women are moving from, there's still a majority of them in those sort of like what we call sort of the social issue areas, right? So health, human services, those are the main ones, education. But what we see is that a lot of women are moving to, okay, we understand how important it is to be the finance chair, or maybe it's the education finance chair. And we are seeing a trend and an upward tick in women committee chairs in those areas.
Thank you. And I'm Jackie from Florida Phoenix. I didn't introduce myself earlier, but I'm also curious if you guys track anything related to their requests that they do for funding for their districts, because that's something that I'm curious about, in seeing if there's any trends for do women ask for more or less, and then how much money are they getting?
That one we haven't as much. I'm not sure that we have all of the info that we would need in order to do that one, besides doing an analysis of each of the fiscal sort of packages, because every state does fiscal analysis different and writes different types of fiscal notes for each of their bills, or does like a fiscal impact for each of those. I'm trying to think of how we would do it. It is interesting, though. I haven't looked into it. I know there's some tracking around, of course, like campaign finances, right? And if women can raise as much as men, and they typically don't, right? But, and that seems to impact a little bit too, like, is this why women don't run as often, right? Because of that, the campaigning aspect of this is challenging also. But I haven't done it at the district level.
Get into the district level, but we do have a session specifically on money later in the fellowship. So hopefully we'll get to that. If I could just sneak one in real quick. Sure. So you mentioned a couple times, the year of the women. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the media is part of putting that forward. What do you think of that framing?
Putting on my NCSL cap, right? My very bipartisan. I think it's helpful in some ways, right? Women like being a part of that, but they also sometimes, from what we've heard, especially from some of our Republican leadership, is that it's not helpful. That it's not helpful to peg 1 year as something when we're trying to go to every year as this, right? And we're still so far behind in parity.
My name's Emily Anderson Stern. I'm from the Salt Lake Tribune in Utah. And you talked a little bit about Utah, and kind of on that note, about how, our Senate and House minority leaders are both Latina, and Democratic leadership, they're all women. And you mentioned that, even you're hearing from, say, like Representative Ballard, that when women are in leadership positions in Utah, it's kind of like there's not a ton of political power there. And I'm curious, across state legislatures, how often you're seeing that when women are in leadership positions, they are in places where they don't have political power, and how often you're seeing maybe tokenism of women lawmakers where, say we have a Republican supermajority, and a lot of times on bills that have to do with, say, women's reproductive health, it'll be male lawmakers writing those, and that most people know that, but then they put, they'll get a woman Republican lawmaker to be the sponsor. So I'm curious kind of what you're seeing as far as trends like that, and whether, as you're seeing gains, how substantive those are.
Yeah. Well, first I want to be very clear that it wasn't Representative Ballard necessarily who said that. It was just more of we had a convening of Republican women in Utah and, asked, we're seeing this growing minority leadership. What does that mean? And the general consensus there was, it's great, except, right? So it's great, except they don't have any political power. We don't see a lot of tokenism. And that's why when I did the slide, it was a little bit tricky, because sometimes when at NCSL, what we say is legislative leadership, we include sort of the speaker pro tem, the majority leader, and the minority leader. And it's why when I did that other slide that you see, it did not, when I did this slide, it's why I did not put those in, right? Because what we're seeing here is only the top, right? Only the top leadership. So it's the women with sort of, in some cases, true political power, right? They have a lot of control over how they approach everyday sort of issues and everyday operation within their chambers. So one is like Massachusetts, for example, right? So the Senate president there, she took down all of the past, because there was a wall of like past Senate presidents, right? And she was like, I was so sick of walking into my office and seeing a wall full of old white men. Like, this was just not what I wanted to, like, this wasn't my motivator. So she took that wall down, so it's just those little like small notions that mean, okay, and then what she did was she replaced it with firsts, right? Women who were the first to do this or that, and highlighting some women in leadership. So I don't know if that answered all parts of your question. I feel like I forgot one. Was there something that I missed?
Well, I guess, as I was talking a little bit about how sometimes, say specifically in my state, where you'll see bills having to do with women's issues that will be written by male lawmakers, and then they'll, say, especially around abortion, and then they'll recruit women to be the sponsors. So if you're seeing kind of women being used in a token way like that across state legislatures, or if you are hearing frustration from lawmakers about seeing their women colleagues, being used as in that way.
I think, and you're going to have a session on this later, I think what women are feeling is there are heightened threats, right, to whether or not they are willing to be in a specific position in order to mold to whatever the majority is, right, or aligning with their party politics. So I think there's a lot of support, and you will hear some women say, hey, I am in this position and my party didn't support me in this way, but they also only wanted me to do X, Y, and Z. That is not the case in every state, I don't think. It's definitely not, but I do think there is always going to be some version of that, right? And you'll hear, for us, it's always better to go to the women legislators and ask, have you experienced this? What does this look like? And what did you do about it? So I think there are some things like that, but that's not necessarily an area that we tend to focus on, just because we don't. There are others that do, but we tend to not necessarily focus on, were you persuaded to be the sponsor of this bill kind of thing.
Sorry, I have the microphone. Yeah. Shaylee, Montana. I love talking about Montana, so as soon as you brought it up, I had to talk about it again. So something I'm curious about in your work with caucuses. So Montana does have parity. Our American Indian Caucus does have parity now with state population, indigenous population. We are also now a very red state. And we do have lawmakers who are, like, the caucus is bipartisan in Montana. I guess I'm curious, like, if just anecdotally could maybe speak to some of the challenges that women in that caucus specifically have maybe faced, or like ways they've been successful at creating that parity. And, there's some intersectionality there between race parity and gender parity, and just anecdotally what that has looked like.
Yeah. I think Montana is unique because of how the state legislators, the native state legislators, have positioned themselves and what they've decided to choose to be their platform, right? So they've really leaned into and ensuring that they understand that the role of them as state legislators is very important for the preservation of culture and tribal sovereignty, right? So I think that's sort of unique in the way that they can kind of lean into that as a bipartisan, right, sort of native caucus within the state, right? Because what we're talking about, national caucuses, and then some of the states have state caucuses of color, just like they have women caucuses. And we didn't even get into how some of the women's caucuses came from, some of the state legislators' color caucuses. Saw in Maryland right after the state legislator color of the Black Caucus was introduced, right? The Women's Caucus also followed suit and became a little more formal. So there are some trends there, right, on like what types of support is given to legislators who don't look like the typical legislator, and where they lean into for their own network and support varies, right? So I think it just depends. Like, for example, in Montana, they have really leaned into, okay, what does native language preservation look like? And that is a bipartisan issue, right? How do we support that? How do we support tribes? Are we doing enough to support tribes? If we're looking at, 90% of native students going to public schools, how do we ensure that the curriculum includes native language preservation and history? And that all comes from native legislators and having that representation at the state level.
Do you have time for one? I know that there's so many questions. Do you have time for one more?
Yeah, as long as you're good. If we're good.
Hi, Casey Smith with the Indiana Capitol Chronicle. Real quick, you had mentioned the menstrual tax at the end of session that was stripped out, so that did not pass.
Yeah.
But I did have kind of a two-part question. The first was if NCSL tracks or has data available at all for in the part-time legislatures what women legislators do outside of the state houses. And then secondly, separate from that, if there are any resources or tracking or investigating of women who run for seats but are unsuccessful, and kind of to help us understand what some of the barriers are for them, especially in a state like Indiana where we have lots of women run but are ultimately unsuccessful.
Yeah, I think some of that is going to be addressed over the next couple of days. The first part of that, though, and kind of going back to remind me what your like first part, because I had
what women do outside of the state house and the part-time legislatures.
Yes. So NCSL has a survey that we do every 10 years or so of what legislators' occupations are. And it's been harder and harder to get that information and get responses because it's just busier, right? And what we're finding is that if we send an email like everyone else, right, it's not as easy to get a response anymore by email. But of course, we were always saying and always trending around, we didn't break it up by gender, right? But it was like, okay, which are the top occupations for legislators outside of their state legislative office? So of course, lawyers always popped up to the top. But we haven't done anything really recently, especially focused on gender.
Survey was?
I want to say 2020, because we kind of do it, we follow census. But I'm not, I can definitely get back to you, like take my contact info down so that you can, so that I can reach out to our Center for Legislative Strengthening on that, because they might have that